Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a delight to be here at the next big question. Thank you for joining us. I think you're in for a very thought-provoking and fascinating evening. My name is Frank O'Day. I'm a very recent board member to this organization, CIFAR, the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. I became involved with the organization in just such an event. The next big question, the last event was being held in Ottawa about a year ago. I went and I became engaged with the research, the minds, and then after meeting with some of the management and board, fascinated with the organization. It is doing great work, and I trust you'll find the same at the end of this evening. In a few minutes, we're going to hear from three researchers, all addressing and answering the same question. Who are you? Each with a different answer. Each based on their own research and collaboration with other CIFAR colleagues. Please engage with them at the end of the evening when our CEO and President, Aviva Hocek, will join us here on the stage and lead a discussion with the three researchers and then take a few questions from the audience. I hope you find it as fascinating and as interesting as the one I saw in Ottawa. Before we get going, let me tell you a little about CIFAR. In my own words, CIFAR tries to bring together the finest minds in the world to address topics that will change the way we live, work, and play in this world. Big questions, and we bring together the finest minds in the world. Really a remarkable organization. Started in 1982 with three clear goals. One, to focus on advanced research that creates breakthrough knowledge. Two, advances Canada's research community. And three, fuels innovation. Today we mobilize 385 researchers, 107 institutions, 16 countries. Our scholars represent 50 different fields of research, and 40% are in the top 1% of their fields today. There's no university anywhere in the world that has this concentration of brain power. We're very proud that these researchers agreed to join us in pursuing the next big question. None of this would happen without the support of individuals, foundations, and corporations. We also have received funding from the Government of Canada, the provincial governments of Ontario, Alberta, and British Columbia. If you're not already a supporter, I respectfully submit that perhaps you would think about doing so. A donation to CIFAR is truly an investment in the future. One of the particular benefits that I enjoy so much working at CIFAR is working with our President and CEO, Aviva Hocek. I'd like to invite her to the podium now to get the evening underway. Thank you all once again for joining us, and please join me in welcoming Aviva Hocek.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to thank Frank for being our host this evening. Frank joined our board this winter and immediately became one of our most active directors. Thank you for the entrepreneurial energy and passion that you bring to our advanced research work in Canada. We're really happy to have you on the team. Now tonight we're really fortunate to have with us three CIFAR researchers who not only are at the forefront of their respective fields, but are also very talented explainers and storytellers. Our first speaker is Irene Bloemraad. Irene is a Canadian who now resides in California, where she's an associate professor of sociology at the University of California. She studies the nexus of immigration, politics, and national identities. Please welcome Irene Bloemraad, who will answer the question, who are you, by making the case that you are your citizenship. An interesting thing on a day like today, isn't it? Irene?
Well, I'd like to thank you all for coming out, especially on an election day when you might be wanting to find out what's happening in Atlantic Canada through tweets. Or maybe not, right? It's also a particular pleasure to be here in Toronto because one thing that Haviva did not mention is that my family immigrated to Canada in the 1970s, and like so many other immigrants, we first landed in Toronto. And so I learned English in Toronto and spent some years in the school system here, so it's really a pleasure to be here. This event was planned before the election was called, but once I realized that this event and the election was on the same day, I did not think it was just coincidence. I actually think it's a divine sign that I am right and that you are your citizenship. So now let me give you some additional evidence for that. If you look at a host of different surveys, different opinion polls done by government, done by media, done by groups such as the Association of Canadian Studies, you find that roughly 9 out of 10 people living in Canada say that they feel a sense of belonging to Canada and that they feel pride in their identity as Canadians or being in Canada. Sometimes those percentages are around 85%, 84%, sometimes they go up to 92%, but it's a really incredible number when you think about it. Imagine what would happen if 9 out of 10 residents of Canada all agreed on tax policy, right? Or imagine if 9 out of 10, people in Canada agreed on the environment and what we should do about the environment. So this really, I think, speaks to the notion that citizenship and feelings of belonging to a nation or to a country really do matter to people in a fundamental way. Now, in the Canadian context, we can go a step further and say, well, what exactly is that identity? What does being Canadian really mean anyways, right? And we have some opinion poll survey data on that. And you might want to think, before I go to the next slide, what would you think other people in Canada would say to that question in terms of your identity? As someone who later from Toronto moved to Saskatoon, hockey might be up there. Surprisingly, it's not as popular as a sign of Canadian identity than you might think. So if you look at what constitutes Canadian identity, this is based on a poll that the Environics Institute did in 2010, you find that healthcare is really prominent, that over 80% of people answering this survey said that healthcare is strongly associated with an identity as Canadian. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms is a significant source of identity or something that reflects Canadian identity. The flag and the national parks. And the interesting thing about these 4 items that are sort of topping the list, I think, is if you cast your mind back 50 years ago and you imagine what people might have answered to the question of Canadian identity 50 years ago, at least 3 of these 4 wouldn't have been there because they didn't exist. And that raises a really interesting question about the nature of identities and the nature of identity change. Now you can see going down the list, we have fewer people who say the RCMP and multiculturalism. Still over a majority of people answering this poll at least thought that was a strong part of Canadian identity. The Queen, when this was polled, was not part of that. Maybe on Friday there would have been a little bit more. But this is again a very significant change from 50 years ago. Now, why is this important? This is important because when I said that these people who are polled in these opinion polls responded these ways, these are all residents of Canada, which, as many of you probably know, includes about 20% of the population of Canada that was not born in this country. So you have a very significant foreign-born population that was born somewhere else, maybe spent some years growing up there, come to Canada, and then they respond in ways that are very similar to these responses of all other Canadians who are maybe born in this country. And this really represents, I think, an important issue when we think about identity, is this challenge, I think, about constructing identities, and especially things such as national identities and notions of citizenship in the context of diversity. And this is clearly not just a Canadian issue. This is something that touches many, many countries in the world. Most of my research focuses on North America, Canada, and the United States, and Western Europe, but we can go beyond that as well. Now, if you look at some of the countries of Western Europe and North America, and we look at what proportion of the population is foreign-born, which I'll do right now, you'll find, perhaps surprising for some people in this room, that the US is actually not as immigrant as we might imagine. right? Canada and Australia are much more immigrant countries than the United States is. But the other striking thing, I think, for many people is how significantly immigrant many European countries that we might not, at least in North America, associate with immigration, are really countries of immigration as well. So, I would draw your attention, for example, to the fact that Switzerland has many more foreign-born people in its population than the United States, and actually more than Canada and Australia even. Or it's about the same as Australia. And then countries such as Sweden and even Spain now, which has gone through massive transformations in the last 2 decades, are also at a reasonably high level of immigration. Why does this matter? In the context of identity, over the last year especially, we've been having lots of debates around multiculturalism and pluralism. And many of you might remember back in October, the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, she made headlines when she pronounced that multiculturalism had utterly failed in Germany. And so this cartoon, shows Angela Merkel at the grave of multicultural Germany, which is now resting in peace. She was not the only one. Nicolas Sarkozy, the president of France, made similar statements, and just a few months ago, David Cameron, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, announced, or he stated that state multiculturalism was a problem, that even if Britain, respected diversity and thought it was a good thing, the government should not be involved and instead should embrace a muscular liberalism in its place. And Canada has not been immune to this. Back in October, I was actually at a series of CIFAR meetings then and was reading the Globe and Mail. And the Globe and Mail came out with an editorial that followed up on a series that had been doing. And as you can see here, the Globe's editorial said, multiculturalism should be struck from the national vocabulary. Canada needs to have the courage to build a successful society around the concept of citizenship. Now, what this suggests is that there is a contradiction, if not an outright conflict, between diversity, multiculturalism, politics of pluralism on the one hand, and common citizenship, national identity, like I suggested in those first slides on the other hand. And one of the things that my research is pointing to is that that is a completely false dichotomy, and in fact that our public policies can help constitute our national identities, and this notion that 9 out of 10 people in Canada say, yeah, I belong to this country. Citizenship is part of my identity. So I want to not just pose the question of who am I, I'm a citizen, because I'm sure if, tomorrow and a week from now you're sitting in the TTC and someone goes up to you and says, who are you? You're not going to immediately say, oh, I'm a Canadian citizen. That's my primary identity. It might be true if you go traveling and someone asks, who are you? You might say Canadian as a first answer to that question. But we all know that our identities are multiple. Depending on the context, depending on what you're doing, depending on who's asking the question, you might answer that question differently. What my research on identity and citizenship shows, however, is that that constitution of who I am, that answer to that question, is fundamentally influenced by things such as public policy. And so I think all three of us tonight are going to give you different stories based on our research on how identity is constructed. What are the means by which we get this sense of who we are in relation to others? And my contribution to this discussion would be that when you're voting, and the government who's going to follow up from that vote makes decisions on healthcare, makes decisions on the environment, on military engagement, that actually might have an effect on your own identity and future generations' identity as whether they belong or not and how they feel about things such as citizenship. Now what I want to do is I want to give you a little bit of evidence from some research I did based on a Canada-US comparison. And so if you look with using census data, comparing the proportion of immigrants, foreign-born individuals, who take up either Canadian or American citizenship across the 20th century, so across the sweep of that century, this is what you'll see. The blue bars are the United States, the red bars are Canada, and if you look carefully across this table, you'll see that from about 1900 up to 1970, they're pretty similar. Sometimes Canada's a little bit higher, sometimes the proportion of naturalized citizens in the United States are a little bit higher. But following 1970-71, something remarkable starts happening. The Canadian numbers keep inching up, more and more immigrants take out citizenship, and the US numbers drop. Now, many of you can probably start thinking immediately, well, the United States has many more undocumented people. There's a very large illegal or unauthorized population in the United States. That's definitely the case, and once you take those people out, because they can never become citizens, that gap diminishes a little bit. The type of immigrants and the origins of those immigrants are different in the two countries, and we can account for that as well, and I've done statistical analyses that look at that as well. But I would suggest, and in fact I would argue quite strongly, that even if you take these things into account, you're still going to find a difference where immigrants in Canada over the last 10 to 20 years are much more likely to take out Canadian citizenship than American citizenship. And this really speaks that I think the answer to the question of identity and who we are in the Canadian context, citizenship is very, very important. I've already said my punchline, public policy matters. Let me tell you why it matters. Let me tell you why I think public policy matters. If you talk to immigrants, and I did 151 in-depth interviews with people both in the Boston area and Toronto, talked to ordinary immigrants, talked to community leaders, talked to some government folk. If you talk to people, especially immigrants, how they became citizens, unless they're very highly educated, have really a good grasp of English, etc., they're going to tell you a story of citizenship that is related to their social networks, the people they know, their community organizations, the ethnic media that they might listen to or watch sometimes. Fundamentally, integration into a society is about the social connections we have. And this is a theme that's very much part of the CIFAR group that I'm in, which is social interactions, identity, and well-being. Those social interactions, and it can be with organizations, it can be with community leaders, churches, religious organizations, etc., they facilitate that process of citizenship. And so I'm going to give you some examples of that in a second. That infrastructure, the supportive infrastructure of community organizations, is fundamentally helped along by things such as settlement policy, integration policy, multiculturalism policies. So the policy infrastructure provides a foundation upon which immigrant communities can mobilize themselves. They can do their own things, they do their own stuff, but especially for immigrant communities that might not have the same resources, might not come with a lot of financial capital, might not come with a lot of education because where they came from, they didn't really have the opportunity to go very far. They really need sort of this seed money, let's say, to help them get integrated and also get on the path of citizenship. And then finally, the final point I'd like to make is that public policy, it's important for instrumental reasons. Having a room available for people to meet so that they can talk about something in the local library is fundamentally important for helping this process along. But it's also the symbolic notions behind policies. And this is really difficult for a researcher to get her fingers on, right? You talk to people, oh, the symbolism is really important. And everyone's like, yeah, give me a regression statistic to really show me that symbolism is important. And I can tell you it's hard to convince people. But based on the interviews I've done, the policies in place obviously do things. They give money, they build, they do technical things, they set up regulations, but those policies also, in the minds of people, represent things. And if you want additional evidence beyond the immigrant case, just think of that first or the second statistic I showed you about healthcare. Who would have thought that someone's identity as a Canadian would be linked to whether you have health insurance or not? But clearly that is the case in Canada. So policies carry these identity components with them, which then builds this bundle of citizenship. So I just want to give you some flavor of this argument. I could talk for hours and hours, and I warned the CIFAR people that I probably would if I wasn't reined in. But I want to give you a sense of what I argued in terms of the social process of gaining citizenship. So this is based on an interview I did with a Vietnamese American. He had not had an opportunity to finish high school, living in the Boston area. And I asked him, how did you become a citizen? His English was not very good. I had to use a translator to do this interview. And he responded to me, I also took a course in Chinatown. I had to pay. There were a mix of people in the class. My friends who had already taken the course told me about it. So, he was trying to become a citizen, needed some help to help him along the process, to fill out the form, to make sure he had enough English to pass the English test for the citizenship exam. And so he asked his friends, they told him to take this course, he took the course, that helped him along. Here's an example from Toronto. This is a woman, a Portuguese-Canadian woman who also did not have the opportunity to finish high school in the Azores before she came to Toronto. And when I asked her about her process, she said, well, Manuel, it was another Portuguese Canadian, he's the one who taught us to get the papers. He applied for a supplement from the government to pay him to teach us about the politics to become a citizen, not just me, lots of Portuguese. So a similar story of, I need some help to get this done. I was, helped along. Someone taught us how to do it. There's a, civics exam that you have to do. There's some questions you have to answer. It helps a lot when someone is holding your hand and sort of, teaching you, quizzing you on these things. One key difference, of course, between these quotes is that the gentleman in the United States had to pay for his classes. In the case that I point out here, these courses were subsidized by government, and so Tilla did not have to really pay for them. This is a story that was repeated frequently through the interviews, that in the US, it's much more a grassroots, you have to help each other get ahead kind of strategy. There is some support. There's some great community-based organizations doing work in the Boston area, but it was just less prevalent than you'd have in a place like Toronto. All right, the other thing, the symbolism. So I don't have statistics, but let me give you some examples of why I think it really, really matters. I interviewed Doris Meisner, who was the commissioner for the Immigration and Naturalization Service when that still existed under the Clinton administration. She is probably one of the INS commissioners who were most dedicated to citizenship. She wanted to put the N back in INS. She was going to put naturalization at the forefront. It didn't work out that way. She actually started the increase in the border control in the United States and was the person to actually put a lot of money onto border control in the southern border. And when she reflected back on her time as an INS commissioner, she said, the dominant culture of the agency is rooted in a view of immigration as a source of security and law enforcement vulnerability more than of continued nation building. And I would argue this interview was done before INS moved into the Department of Homeland Security, but currently in the United States, Immigration and Naturalization Services are within the Department of Homeland Security. And just by the name of that agency, you can imagine that that hasn't really changed. In the Canadian case, I interviewed some senior officials at Citizenship and Immigration. I took a sort of standard American line and said, why are you using taxpayer dollars to do all of this citizenship stuff? And the woman I spoke to got quite upset with me and said, why would we not encourage citizenship? We say everyone belongs, that we believe in diversity. When we promote citizenship, let's be clear. It talks about applying, yes, but at its beginning, it's about integration. One of the things that I found remarkable about this is that it represents an ethos towards not just getting immigrants through the administrative procedure of becoming Canadian citizens and being able to have a passport, but it reflected, at least in this woman's case and in some other people's case when I interviewed them, a bigger vision of what they thought their role was, even if they were civil servants. This was not someone who was political. This was someone who's a senior civil servant in Ottawa. And this kind of attitude, immigrants get this. They understand what's going on. So with an interview that I did with a Portuguese-American woman who was low income in the Boston area, she was complaining about rents. And she said, but they, the government, don't know how it is. You can't say, sir, send the people that care about the immigrants because they are the people who can't speak up. There is nowhere to complain to, and we can't complain. So very much a feeling of being shut out. In this other case, Joe was a really interesting person because he had deep attachments to Portugal and he actually held both Canadian and American citizenship. And I asked him, well, who are you? I guess I asked him, who are you? What are you? And he said, I'm Canadian. And I said, well, why are you Canadian? Why not these other things? And he said, well, I like the way the government runs things. I guess the great support, the multicultural stuff, the social assistance. We pay a lot of tax, that's true. But the great concern of government, the help for the citizens themselves. And so he felt much more included in government and in the citizenry. So when, you can imagine Joe having to answer this question about, do you feel you belong? And he would be one of those 9 out of 10 residents of Canada who'd say, yeah, I do feel like I belong. This is, I don't know if this is important. This is sort of a fancy conceptual map for academics about what I just said. It's not even that fancy, really. But basically the argument is that government policy provides both material resources but also symbolic resources that they communicate and give to mainstream actors. It doesn't have to be immigrant communities, it can be lots of other people, It affects ordinary immigrants and their sense of belonging, and it affects ethnic organizations and community leaders. And these groups then can mobilize around some of these issues, and then of course they affect government in turn. I want to end with 2 slides because I know my time is running out. Why does citizenship matter? Remember how I started with Angela Merkel and Germany, etc.? I just did a new paper that we're just sending out for academic review where we looked at the European Social Survey, and we basically divided countries in Europe between countries that are open in terms of citizenship and have embraced diversity policies, multicultural policies, versus those who have not. And so let's see if multiculturalism is really bad and divisive. If you look at perceived discrimination, the unitary countries, those are countries that really try to have a unitary notion of belonging. Immigrants in those countries are more likely to perceive discrimination. So they're more likely to see discrimination vis-a-vis themselves compared to the pluralist places, the places that have more diversity policies, more open citizenship. And if you ask about political trust, trust in political institutions, trust in politicians, the ones who are in the more pluralist societies are more likely to feel more likely to feel trust in those institutions and politicians than the ones in the more unitary societies, or the societies where the notion of citizenship is very unitary. And really, the last one, because it's election day, I want to share with you some data on the actual incidence of foreign-born individuals in the House of Commons and the House of Representatives in the 2 countries. And the data I'm going to show you takes the proportion of the House that is foreign-born and divides that by the proportion of the general population that is foreign-born to create an index, and then we can just sort of see how immigrant are the houses. First answer is not very much, when you would normally think that number should be 1, right? So if there's 20% of immigrants in the general population, maybe there should be 20% of immigrants in the House. That's not the case. However, Canada's not doing that bad. The US is not doing that good. And I would argue that part of this is just exactly the legal citizenship story I just told you. You can't run for office if you're not a citizen, so part of the fact that there's so much citizenship in the Canadian immigrant population really helps this process. But I would also argue, to get back to the very first point, public policy really matters in constituting our identities, and in the Canadian case, it's an identity that does have important links to public policies, not only multiculturalism, but things like healthcare, national parks, etc. And then the answer to who we are is we are a citizenship. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Irene. Our next presenter is Clyde Hertzman, who holds the dubious status of having been appointed to more CIFAR programs than any other researcher in the Institute's history. He's been a member of 4 programs, and when you see him, you'll see he's not 150 years old. He's an epidemiologist, a world-renowned expert on early childhood development, and a professor at the University of British Columbia. Please welcome Clyde Hertzman, who will answer tonight's question, who are you, by arguing that you are what your genes experience. Clyde?
Well, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. You may think from the title that I've got up here that this will be, a now for something completely different. But as I talk through my talk, you'll see the ways in which what I've got to say and what Irene has said and what Alex will say actually fit together in a certain way. My basic idea that I'm here to put forward is that we understand now an awful lot more about how our DNA works than we ever understood before. And what we've come to understand now is that our DNA, our genes, are not some sort of a blueprint which then go on to print us out as people and to simply determine what our lives are going to look like. Instead, the DNA is in conversation with the environments where we grow up, live, and learn. And out of that conversation back and forth come a number of emergent properties. And some of these emergent properties, such as our cognitive development and our social and emotional development, are basic capacities that go on to shape the opportunity to create an identity of the sort that we're here to think about tonight. Now, to give you an idea, This slide here shows you Southern Ontario divided into a number of neighborhood areas. And it's showing the fraction of children as they transition from preschool to school who are vulnerable or behind where we'd like them to be on either their physical, their social, emotional, or their language and cognitive development. This is based on a program that we've developed here in Canada that is now covering most of the country, and it is population-based data. Now, I know that it's very hard to read this, and I don't want you to read it. What I want you to recognize, though, is that as you go from the green neighborhoods to the brown neighborhoods, the fraction of children who reach school age, behind where we'd like them to be on one or more of those domains of development, goes up 17-fold. So the lowest vulnerability neighborhood in Ontario, between about 4 and 5% of the children are behind where we'd like them to be on their development. And in the highest vulnerability areas, it's running 65 to 70%. So that in a modern society like ours, and it's similar in other parts of Canada, by the time kids reach school age, the qualities of their early experience have been such that what ought to be no more than 10% of kids being vulnerable has spread out to this point where we have a 17-fold variation in the vulnerabilities in kids' development that form the basic building blocks upon which we can create an identity. Now, the reason that this occurs early on in life has got to do with the fact that there is a very dense network of sensitive periods in brain and biological development early on. And as I'm speaking, a number of these competencies are being laid out on this graph, where the gray part of the graph divides into the lighter whitish color at the transition to school age. And so what you can see is, starting at age 0, going up towards the beginning of school, there's a dense network of competencies that are emerging in early life. When we say that there are sensitive periods in brain and biological development, what we're saying is these are periods where exuberant growth occurs in brain cell to brain cell connections as a result, largely, of the quality of environmental experience that you get during that period of time. So sensitivity means sensitivity to the environments in which you grow up, live, and learn. Some of the things that occur here are fundamental to identity. So you see the white line showing vision there. Well, what's going on during the sensitive period in vision development is partly the opportunity to recognize other human beings as the same species. In other words, that basic imprinting that allows you to know that you, in fact, belong to the human race, as it were, and that you aren't something else. Similarly, connections are starting to be made between the visual systems and deep structures in the midbrain of our brain, such as the amygdala and the locus ceruleus, which are centers that have got to do with affiliation and attachment. In other words, we get to that point where, if we've been lucky, we start to recognize that the smile means that we belong, and the frown means that something's going wrong, and that we belong certain places, and that we are not alien one way or another. So the sensitive periods in visual pathways and the things they connect to are fundamental to the sense of belonging. And if you get that, a consistent set of human faces up close at the human focal length of 13 inches or so, early on in life, you get it. And if you don't, you don't. And when you don't, that means that there are barriers to you creating a constructive identity based on those very, very deep kind of things. Similarly, in terms of things like emotional control, it is in the early years that the opportunity to develop verbal negotiation skills instead of physical aggression emerges. And that, of course, has a huge amount to do with whether or not your identity as it emerges is one that is harmonious or one that is oppositional one way or another. Thirdly, language has a sensitive period throughout the early years. And in this period of time, children's development of receptive language, what they understand, and expressive language, what they can say, goes up pretty much as a straight dose response with the number of words and the variety of words that are spoken directly to them per unit time. So that over the first 5 years of life across North America, we have a 30 million word gap, which is to say that the child who has had the most language spoken to them in the first 5 years of their life has had accumulation of 30 million more words spoken to them than the child who's heard the least. And with that difference goes the ability to understand and to express. And with the ability to understand and express goes the capacity to form concepts of the self and others. And then finally, by age 3 and 4, what's starting to happen is early experience is starting to shape our executive functions. In other words, what we focus on, how we interpret it, how we make decisions, and so forth. Such that children who have grown up in chaotic, threatening, unpredictable environments tend to develop executive function systems that are hyper-aroused but have difficulty with focused attention. Whereas children who grow up in environments which are calmer and more predictable and safer have an easier time mounting a focused attention response. And what that means is that they have an easier time developing in a knowledge-oriented world, a world which asks us to engage in focused attention sorts of tasks. And so by the time kids reach school age, a whole series of things have occurred which are either capacities or incapacities that are boundary conditions for developing an identity in our society. Now, after that happens, we have evidence, not so much from questions of identity formation, but from other areas that show the ways in which these things persist throughout the life course. And so by the end of the second decade of life, things like school failure, unwanted teenage pregnancy, and criminality are influenced independently by what has happened early on in life, independent of the influences that come thereafter. By the third and fourth decades of life, things like obesity, elevated blood pressure, and depression have an independent influence from the early years. Other things matter after the early years, but the early years of that can still be seen. By the fifth and sixth decade of life, you can see the influence of the early years on things like heart disease, diabetes, and other chronic diseases. And by later in life, you can see premature aging and memory loss being associated with the early years as well as things later on. And I have a note to myself, now that I'm approaching the end of the sixth decade of life, to re-edit this slide. The point I'm trying to make is that what happens in the early years continues to have influences throughout the life course. So when it comes to matters of identity that we're here to talk about tonight, we are interested then in the way in which these early shaping factors can persistently influence identity throughout the life course. Now, one of the things that we've been doing, and this is very much the work of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, is working on a concept called biological embedding, trying to understand the ways in which systematic differences in the experiences that people have in different walks of life actually gets under the skin and scalp and influences our behavior, our organ systems, our cells, and right down to the level of the expression of genes in ways that then go on to influence our health, well-being, learning, and behavior across the life course. And so the concept is the biological embedding of social experience, and the metaphor is archeology, because we're talking about something that goes from superficial to something that goes very deep. So at the, what I've been calling the shallow end of the archeology, at the whole person and at the organ system level, what we've been interested in particularly are those systems that actually carry on a two-way conversation with the outside world. So I talked earlier on about the affiliative structures in the midbrain. We have the stress response pathways such as the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. We have the prefrontal cortex and executive function. And if we put these systems together, what we have are the things that allow you to feel like you belong or are alienated, the things that allow you to feel stressed or not, the things that have got to do with the way in which you judge things of the kind of variety that Irene spoke about in her presentation. So in fact, at the shallow archeology level, what we have is, in effect, an identity system, a series of structures within the brain in particular that work together to create the neurobiological conditions for an identity to occur. And that's very important, that be, in a sense, the place where you can see the strongest impacts of the social environment operating on the developing human. And so this is one example. And this is an example that can be tied right back to that original map, because what it's got to do with here is children from relatively privileged environments who are also, in this case, in low vulnerability areas. So this would be like those green areas on the map before. And the others are from lower socioeconomic environments, which in this case happen to be high vulnerability, or the brown areas. And so we've actually gone out, gotten children from these areas, put a shower cap on their head with 128 leads, and given them a task that requires them to focus their attention on something and then watch to see what goes on inside of their heads. And the main thing to notice here is that on the left, when you average over all of the kids from the green zone, there is a sharp notch in that black line at the bottom at 0.3 seconds. And on the right-hand side, you don't see the same notch. That notch that you see there, that's the focused attention notch. In other words, by the time these kids are in transition to school, we are seeing that their brains function differently. That in fact, the kids who are coming from the environments of low vulnerability are able much more easily to mount a focused attention response than the kids from the other side. Now you might be thinking, uh-oh, that sounds like genetic determinism to me. Well, it's not. You should know that in 3 months of basic training program that they developed at the University of Oregon, you can produce that notch on the right-hand side. But you have to do it at the right time in order to get it. This is an example, though, of what we mean by the shallow archaeology. Seeing the way in which the differences in the context in which these kids have grown up has penetrated to the level of the functioning of their executive systems in ways that could go on and shape their identities later on in life. Now, beyond that, we're now going to talk about the deep archaeology. And in particular, we're going to introduce this notion of epigenesis and the epigenetic influences of early environments. Now, before I define this, I want to show you some interesting pictures. The first here are these two butterflies. They live in sub-Saharan Africa. The one on the right, as you can see, is a bit bigger than the one on the left. It's blue, the other one's sort of orange. The one on the right has a tendency to sort of hide behind leaves and live a rather dull and sluggish life, whereas the one on the left floats around and flutters around, kind of like a Walt Disney butterfly. So what? Here you are out on election night, and here's this character telling you about butterflies in sub-Saharan Africa. Well, the so what of this is that until the genome could be read, everybody thought these were two completely different butterflies. Turns out, however, they are the same butterfly. Genetically, the same. The difference is that one of them was in the cocoon during the dry season, the other was in the cocoon during the wet season. That's it. And look at the difference, right? Another example. Here are mice, young mice and adult mice. And you can see by adult age, you've got the small brown one and the absolutely obese yellow one. These also turn out to be identical twins, where they managed to manipulate it so that they could be raised, gestated in different mice mummies and be given different maternal diets, right? So this is entirely based on the difference in maternal diet here between the little brown and the obese yellow. Both of these stories are stories about epigenetics. And what they show, basically, is the genes by themselves are not enough to explain this remarkable variety. That what epigenetics is about things that are persistent and heritable in the sense that you can pass them as cells divide over time, and that change the way in which our DNA functions, but doesn't actually involve mutating the DNA or changing the DNA sequence. This is not about, for instance, the threat from a nuclear power plant exploding and us mutating and things like that. This has got to do with processes, biochemical processes, whereby the outside environment can speak to the body, set about biochemical cascades that can add or remove chemicals that sit on top of the DNA or surround the DNA in various ways, in ways that will change whether or not genes express themselves. And so, as this slide suggests, across the life course we can have the same genome, but we can have many different epigenomes depending on our experience, particularly our experience early on in life. Now, what is new about this? We've always known that every cell in our body has the same DNA, and yet a brain cell is a brain cell and a blood cell is a blood cell. So at some point, they have to differentiate. People have always understood that there was a process of turning genes on and off so that the cells could differentiate. But what we understand now is that it goes way beyond the period of cell differentiation, throughout gestation, into the early years of life, and probably at a diminishing rate throughout the lifetime. So epigenesis at work. Well, we have lots of evidence from how this works now in other species other than humans. For instance, in the rat, the world's most elegant work was done by Moishe Schiff and Michael Meany, two members of the Experience-Based Brain and Biological Development Program of CIFAR, that showed that the degree to which rat mummies lick and suckle their young between day 9 and 16 of their puphood, believe it or not, you call little baby rats pups. Yeah, who knew? That influences the way in which their hypothalamic adrenal axis, pituitary adrenal axis works in the expression of cortisol, which is one of the stress hormones, that influences their capacity to learn new tasks throughout their life course, but that it does so through an epigenetic mechanism, and they've managed to follow the entire biochemical cascade down, identify the genes that are being downregulated, the genes that are being upregulated as a result of increased licking and suckling. And moreover, they've shown that in the female babies who get high licking and suckling, they will go on and be high lickers and sucklers in the next generation, and low will go on to be low. So it is a beautiful model of a nurturant experience, in this case licking and suckling, during a sensitive period in development that has a lifelong impact on learning in this case, that goes intergenerationally, that operates through an epigenetic effect. In rhesus monkeys, another of our fellows in the EBBD program has actually looked at the difference in gene, in epigenetic marks, as I'm going to call them, between rhesus monkeys that are raised by their mothers versus those that are peer-reared. In other words, they put them together just with other baby monkeys and they give them each a little doll to substitute for the mothers. And there, what they find is that of the 20,000 or so genes that can express themselves in the rhesus monkey DNA, that 4,000 of them, or 20% of the genome, are epigenetically different between the peer-reared versus the mother-reared, right? So you can see potentials for very large effects. So with that in place, then, we've started to look at this in humans, and we've looked at it in relation to stress and nutrition and lifestyle. It's been looked at in relation to identical twins diverging over their lifetimes, and we've looked at it in relation to things like maternal care. And in my case, for instance, what we've been interested in, whoops, once again, got it right there, looking backwards in time, taking people who we've been following from birth, who have now we've followed 50 years into their lives, and looking backwards to say, what can we say about the relationship between their epigenetic status in midlife in relation to their early years? And we did that in the 1958 British birth cohort. So this is a sample now of people who were born in the first week of March 1958 in England, Scotland, and Wales that have been followed ever since. And at age 45, we collected white blood cells from these individuals, and we looked at the whole genome to see how much systematic differences we could see in relation to certain things that went on early in life. The first thing that we discovered was that 1,252 genes, in other words, a full 6% of the genome, was affected epigenetically differently depending on whether or not you were high socioeconomic status child, age 0 to 7, or a low socioeconomic status. So this is socioeconomic status between 1958 to 65 being looked at on samples collected in 2003, basically. So after 38 years hang time, 6% of the genome still different in terms of the way it's expressing itself. The next one has got to do with whether or not your mother smoked during pregnancy. This is collected back in 1957-58 when these kids were in utero. And there you can see nearly 800 genes differentially expressed 45 years later on as following this difference in exposure. And then finally, based on, in this case, retrospective reports of abuse, physical, verbal, or sexual, 1,141 genes differentially affected in terms of methylation. So what's starting to happen now that we have these technological capacities and the forms of interdisciplinary groups where epidemiologists like myself and cell biologists of the sort that are brought together under CIFAR programs can work together, we can start to understand how profound these relationships are and the degree to which early experiences can land and can stick on our DNA and change the way that they operate. So the final one I'm going to talk about is something we've been doing recently, and it's very interesting because of the level of precision we're starting to get to. Now we're talking here about epigenetic marks that we can see at age 15 in relation to very, very finely calibrated data collection early on in life. And to make a long story short then, what we discovered is that mothers, but not fathers, stressors in the first 18 months of life are showing an epigenetic mark that persists well into the second decade of life on at least 100 different genes. Yet, in the preschool period, when the kids are 3, 4, and 5, it gradually switches over, so the father stressors are starting to get under the skin and influence children's epigenetic marks, more so than the mothers. Right? It's a very, very interesting way that this is played out, following the kind of thing that if you wanted to caricature it, you could see where the caricature would come from. So we're in early days with this work, as you can see, and it's going to take years, if not decades, to sort out how all of these mechanisms go. But what I'm here to leave you with is the following idea, that basically there is a quality of identity that feeds into what Irene has spoken about and what Alex will speak about, which has got to do with an emergent property of how genes are basically in conversation with the environment at all levels. So there is the individual developing child in the middle, as you can imagine, who is surrounded in a certain way by the family. But these broader environments are playing into the resources and the opportunities that are brought to bear on that child. And those things have the chance of getting under the skin and influencing who we are and who we become. Thanks for listening.
You're beginning to get, I hope, a sense of what some of us who love CIFAR love about CIFAR, and that is that what looks like a single question is actually many questions, and what looks like something that you would answer off the top of your head with a few words actually repays a lot more attention. It has much more texture and ability to engage our thought than you would have thought at the beginning. And I'd like to introduce Alex Haslam, who is our next presenter, who has yet another way to think about the question of identity. When it comes to who are you, he would contend that you are the groups that you belong to. Alex is a social psychologist. He's based at the University of Exeter in England, and he's an innovator in studying the relationship between individual identity and group identities. Please welcome Alex Haslam.
Thank you very much indeed for coming, and thank you very much for your support for CIFAR. I can assure you, speaking on behalf of all of the fellows of the various programs, we very much appreciate it, and our goal is to translate your support into real positive change, not just in the scientific community, but in society as a whole. And I think I'm very pleased that tonight's event is not a competition, because I think everything that Irene has said and everything that Clyde has said is true. And what I want to do is engage in a conversation with them and with you by filling out this story, I think, in an interesting way, by looking at the way in which identity is dictated by the groups that we belong to, so that the nature of the self, if you like, is, if you like, more complex than they suggested. But actually, I think if you, and I'm sure you are listening, I can hear you're listening closely, you will see points of contact between what they have said and what I am going to say. Let's just start by thinking about, if I said to you, who are you? If we met out there, who are you? You'd probably say, well, that's a stupid question. I'm John, or I'm Peter, or I'm Mary, or whatever, I'm Kath. Okay. That indeed is the way that most people think about identity. You know, who am I? Well, I'm an individual. I'm Alex, or I'm Irene, or I'm Clyde. And that surely then the nature of identity is bound up in our individual experiences, our sense of ourselves as I, our unique experiences, our idiosyncratic characteristics, traits, qualities, and so on, experiences. So in that sense, perhaps the true self is our personal, if you like, our personal self, bound up in our personal identity, I and me. So again, we have, if you like, if you think about Irene, Clyde, and myself, we're different. We have nothing in common. We have separate, distinct identities, clearly discernible, and should not to be, in any sense, confused. Well, let's just have a kind of a look at that. So, if you like, if you take that idea, it surely follows that if I really want to understand someone's identity, and if I wanted to understand my own identity, what I would need to do is kind of remove myself from social contact and kind of go deeper and deeper into that personal self. And this is a little experiment that a BBC journalist conducted recently, and his book was published just a few months ago. And this journalist, partly I guess for his own personal reasons, but also out of a sort of peculiar scientific curiosity, went to live as a hermit in the mountains of mid-Wales. And what did he find? This is what he said in this book. What I found was not what you might expect. You might think that such protracted solitude would lead to introspection, to growing self-awareness. But not for me. What happened was that I began to forget myself. My focus shifted almost entirely outwards. It was as if we gain our sense of self from our interaction with other people. Alone, there was no need for identity, for self-definition. So actually going deeper and deeper into the personal self, becoming more of an I, actually you lose contact with identity. So let's now start to explore, if you like, the alternative thesis, the idea that maybe identity is social. Perhaps who we are is not as I, as the unique me, but perhaps is defined by our group memberships. If you're in this room, perhaps you think of yourselves as Canadians. I think Irene's given some compelling evidence to that effect. So probably at least 9 out of 10. I suspect it's higher in this room. Or as students, or as Blue Jay fans, or as CIFAR researchers. So perhaps the true self is social in that way. And myself and my colleagues, many of whom are on this program, but our views as they've kind of evolved as part of the scientific debate that the others have talked about, have come to the view that the self is a social category, and that depending on context, yes, we can define ourselves as individuals in terms of our personal identity as I and me. We certainly do have that distinct identity. I can tell that I am not Clyde, I hope, and he can tell he's not me, and so on. Maybe even more of an issue in the case of Irene. Okay, that we want to know that we're different, and indeed we clearly are. But at the same time, we can define our sense of self in terms of shared group memberships. It's not an accident that we have the words we and us in our vocabulary. They reflect true and authentic aspects of sense, true and authentic aspects of self, our capacity to define ourselves collectively. So, and of course, if you like, if you think about social identity then, the question well becomes, well, which social identities do we find ourselves in terms of? Which group memberships matter to us? So, Clyde and Irene and ourselves could define ourselves in terms of a common identity, as scientists or as CIFAR researchers, but we could also define ourselves in terms of distinct identities based on nationality, based on our gender, or, for example, based on the particular CIFAR research groups that we're a part of. And what you see there is that as different identities become salient, are, if you like, the who we feel close to and who we identify with changes in predictable and meaningful ways. And I'm going to suggest that has profound implications for the kind of behaviour that we would manifest in the context that go along with those identities. So the question then is, when do particular identities become salient? And again, you might think that's a simple question. Actually, it's peculiarly complicated. If I were to answer it in a single sentence, The answer as to when we define ourselves in terms of a particular identity is when it makes sense to do so. In terms of the present context, the situations, environments in which we find ourselves, and our prior experience as a function of previous contexts in which the self has been expressed. I've said the self is a category, a social category. What we know about categories is that they become salient, they become meaningful as an interactive product of fit, when they fit the situation, and when they're accessible. When, if you like, we've had a history of using those categories in the past. So what that means in the case of a self category, a self-social category, a sense of usness, for example, as Canadian, you're more likely to define yourself as Canadian if you're watching Canada play sports and the Olympics, okay? That was a point I think Irene made. There are contexts in which we are comparing ourselves. I'm not a Canadian, but I like to think I am sometimes because it makes me feel good. Okay, so we think of ourselves as Canadian in contrast to other groups that we're maybe competing with or we feel superior to. In fact, probably most definitely are superior to in the case of Americans. Okay, so we again, that comparative context makes that identity salient. If the sport in some sense or the activity is typical of that identity, so you're more likely to feel Canadian if you're watching ice hockey than if you're watching a field hockey, for argument's sake, or if you're watching tennis or something like that. And also if being Canadian has meant something to you in the past. So what happens then is that the fit and accessibility of a particular identity go together to make a particular identity as Canadian, as all these other things, salient in a particular context. If that, if you like, that salience is enacted over a long period of time, and becomes meaningful, then what happens, actually in the ways that actually both Irene and Clyde suggested, that identity is carried forward, and so you get some sense of social identity continuity, so you get if you like, you don't get a disjunction or a sort of schizophrenic narrative of the self. You experience our sense of self in a fluid, flowing, meaningful way. You get social identity continuity, and then that feeds into social identification, so that the social identities, if for example this is a new identity for you as being a supporter of CIFAR or someone who's interested in CIFAR, then that will then become a resource that you can draw upon in other contexts. So whereas this might be the first time you've acted in those ways, in the future then it's going to be more likely that you will have that as a resource and that your behaviour will be determined by that group membership. Okay. So that's, if you like, something about the mechanics of how identity becomes salient, how it becomes psychologically operative. But the other question you might want to know is, well, okay, but why do we need researchers to answer those questions? Does this really matter in any sense? And of course, I think all of us would say, yes, it matters very profoundly. If you like, the simple reason why it matters is because to the extent that a shared social identity, a sense of usness, becomes salient, it has important implications for organisational behaviour. What are those consequences? Well, when a shared identity, as I've been talking a lot about being Canadian, identity as Canadian, for example, becomes salient, then we tend to see ourselves as similar to other members of that category, of that group. So if you happened to have bumped into each other on the metro on the way here, you wouldn't have felt that you had anything in common with the person sitting next to you. But now that you're in this room and your relationship to that other person is defined by this shared identity, you feel that sense of commonality. You feel closer to them. You're more likely to listen to them and think they have something interesting to say to you, and by the same token, they're more likely to think that you have something interesting to say to them. So in that sense, you're more likely to engage in mutual influence to the extent that you share identity, and also to the extent that we define ourselves as a collective. We're more likely to come together and work together to achieve collective goals. That's exactly what Irene was talking about. If we share an identity as Canadian citizens, we're more likely to participate in acts of citizenship that propel Canada forward, rather than say, that's got nothing to do with me, so I don't want to be a part of it. And the really profound point then is that actually social identity is what makes organisational life and organisation as a process possible. Without social identity, without that sense of usness, we couldn't engage in the collaborative activities that, if you like, propel society forward. Now, again, you all work in your organisations. What I would say is central to the ability of those organisations to work is a sense of shared identity, both at the superordinate organisational level, but perhaps at subgroup levels too. And indeed, some other work that we've recently done, a book that I and colleagues have recently published, makes the point that leadership as a process is entirely contingent upon shared identity. And we show that groups that don't have shared identity cannot have the experience of leadership, something fundamental to human society. Again, I say fundamental. Does that really matter? Is this a matter of life and death? Yes, it is. Okay, let's ask a question. You get some epidemiologists like Clyde in here, and you say, well, I'll come to this later. I'm going to say the line I'm coming to is that actually social identities make us human, and that they make life worth living. So again, what's the epidemiological data about threats to health? If you take those things, and I ask you, which of those is the most dangerous activity you could engage in, or the most dangerous condition you could find yourself in? Smoking, a lack of exercise, being obese, having a genetic predisposition to illness, having a poor diet, or being socially isolated. That's actually not physical isolation, it's a sense of psychological isolation. Well, if you read the blurb that goes with this talk, and perhaps if you thought more generally about where this is going, you'd know that actually the biggest threat to health that individuals face throughout the lifespan is social isolation. That's the biggest killer that's out there. One of the reasons we don't focus on the consequences of social isolation is you can't cure it with a drug. So drug companies can't make a lot of money out of, if you like, dealing with that particular problem. Actually, that's a problem we have to deal with ourselves. Some of you will know that reference there. That's Eleanor Rigby. And indeed, one of the great problems of contemporary society is that we have too many lonely people in it. And again, one of the arm of the program that I'm in is really addressing issues of social integration in the way that Irene suggested, and looking at the way in which that has profound effects on health. So actually, if you look in the data, you'll see there are health consequences of the types of thing that Irene and obviously Clyde were talking about. Again, here's some practical data from a study that we conducted with stroke patients in the southwest of England. This was conducted with my colleague, Alex Haslam, who's also my wife, in the southwest of England. She's here as well tonight, if you want to ask her about it. We looked at patients who had a stroke, and we looked at lots and lots of different things. We looked at whether people had belonged to groups before their stroke, whether they had cognitive difficulties, language, executive function difficulties after their stroke, and whether they still belonged to their groups after their stroke. What you see is, as you might expect, that actually if you belonged to groups before your stroke, that's a big predictor of life satisfaction after your stroke. And similarly, if you have cognitive difficulties, that's also a big predictor. There's big numbers, in fact. About equal, in fact, they're not really different. So, of course, if you have language difficulties, your life is going to be less positive than it was prior to the stroke. But what's really interesting, too, is that those two things predict your capacity to maintain group memberships after the stroke. So if you belong to a lot of groups before your stroke, it's likely you'll belong to more groups afterwards. If you have cognitive difficulties, it's less likely that you'll be able to maintain group memberships. And what you see, and you can do fancy statistical analysis, is that you show that all of the power in this analysis comes from the fact that the really big predictor of well-being after a stroke is whether you can maintain valued group membership. So if you experience a sense of social identity loss, that you can't live out a social life that was really important to you prior to the stroke, then your health is seriously compromised. And it's because things like cognitive deficit impinge upon that they are really important. Okay. So, if you like then, the question, okay, that's maybe a slightly depressing story in some sense. So the question is, and again, the question myself and my colleagues in CIFAR in our group really address very fundamentally is, well, can we do anything about that? If a sense of identity loss is going to compromise health and well-being, can we do anything to create a sense of shared identity that will feed into positive health outcomes? And again, to do this, we've done this in a range of vulnerable populations, but what if you look across the lifespan, and you look at the other end of the spectrum from the one that Clyde was talking about, when in their lives do people they're most likely to experience profound identity loss? And it's very much towards the end of people's lives, when they retire, and in particular, if they have to move into a care facility, like a residential care home. And that was who we looked at in this study. This was a situation where in the care homes that we're doing, actually next week we're going off with the support of CIFAR to run one of these studies in Kitchener, but this is based on one we've done previously. We were looking at a care home where the care staff were worried that a lot of the residents had become very isolated and they weren't using communal facilities. In particular, they weren't using the lounges in the wings where their own rooms were located. So what the staff had suggested was that they had a plan to kind of redecorate the lounges because they become dowdy and so on. And maybe by redecorating and freshening them up, they would enhance just make people feel more positive about that, more likely to use those facilities. And of course, this sort of thing doesn't just go on in care homes, it goes on in organisations, it goes on in public spaces and so on. Just by freshening them up, maybe people will come and use them and feel better and so on. So, in this study, to kind of explore that idea, but to, if you like, infuse it with some of these understandings that we have from some of our work and some of our colleagues, we had a design. We had a control condition in a care home where 2 wings had no redecoration whatsoever. There was a kind of a baseline. We had another wing in which the residents moved into that wing and it was beautifully redecorated to the highest possible standard on the basis of decisions that had been made by the staff on the basis of their prior experience, but the residents were not involved in those decisions. And in the third condition, we got wings involved as groups in the process of making decisions about the decor in those new wings. Okay. And our view was there that if we could involve people as a group and create a social identity around that activity, then maybe that would have the kind of positive outcomes, and perhaps only under those conditions, that the care staff wanted to see in their residents. Actually, if I had a bit more time, and I know it's very precious, I'd show you a video of this, but hopefully you might go on the website so you can see it afterwards. This was actually, I should say too, this study was filmed by the BBC and it was part of a documentary on this research. This is what we found. This is social identification. In the baseline condition, over time, you don't see any difference. And the same is true in the control condition where the decisions were made for the residents. Where they're empowered, though, as you would predict, the residents started to feel connected to the other residents. They felt that the person in the room next door to them was no longer a stranger, and the staff the same, so they felt more part of the community. How did that affect on their life satisfaction? Well, as you'd expect in the baseline condition, in the control conditions, there wasn't much change. But in the empowered condition, where they come together as a group, you got a massive increase in life satisfaction. And that was associated with significant drops in depression, clinical depression. It was also associated with cognitive functioning. Kath, who does work in this area as a cognitive neuropsychologist, was assessing their ability to perform cognitive executive tasks. Well, in the baseline condition, over time, as you see in most camps, you actually see some deterioration. In the control condition, that was somewhat arrested, but there was only a marginal increase. But in the empowered condition, what you see is that being involved in a group, feeling part of the community, if you like, infused people with a motivation to actually engage. And what we saw was particularly increases in memory and language functioning, if you like, aspects of cognitive functioning that are strictly motivational. Okay? So people were motivated to engage. And again, part of I think some of the research that Clyde does is suggesting that if you create an intelligent community in which people engage, then you can enhance their cognitive performance more generally. And what we're showing is that applies throughout the lifespan. I said this was a study about social isolation. If you look at the control conditions, what you see is that over time people were not more likely to use their lounges. In fact, after decoration, they were less likely to use their lounges. Why? Because they didn't recognise them anymore. They were foreign places. They would come in, and one woman expressed complete surprise. She thought she'd been moved into another home. It was being redecorated. Yeah, that's right. I have to say it's not quite that funny when you see it. Okay. And but amongst those people who've been involved in the process of change, what you see is a massive increase, in fact a 3-fold increase in that use of space. So again, the cure for social isolation isn't just to create better environments, it's to engage people as collectives in the process of transforming those environments. So creating meaningful social groups builds a sense of shared identity and thereby promotes intellectual and physical engagement. And obviously that's a point that applies in this kind of domain, but I think it speaks very much to the points that both Irene and Clyde were making. And actually, out of this kind of work, collaboratively, there's a book that Kath and I, but others of our CIFAR colleagues have contributed to. And what we talk about this is as the social cure. And this is not an alternative. We're not saying you don't need drugs anymore. But what we're saying is we need to invest more energy in understanding the social determinants of health and driving developments that will help us to deliver alternative forms of cure that are evidentially based and based on really high quality understanding and high quality science. Last two slides very quickly then, to wrap it all up. And again, I think this again speaks to the points that the others have made. Humans are social animals. Again, if you watch, being here in this room is a profound kind of experience. You are here, you live it, you can feel it. If you were to watch it later on the webcast, I think you'll be, these are fantastic technicians doing the filming, by the way, but it will be sort of lifeless in a particular, I hope it isn't, by the way, if you're watching. Okay, but it will be, in a particular sense, it's better to be here. It's better to be next to them, hear the laughter of the person next to you, to feel them, to have a little talk to them about it. The great thing about CIFAR, of course, is it creates these kind of communities. It creates meaningful social identities that are propelling Canadian and world science forward. But again, that speaks to the fact that science, like every other human activity, is profoundly social. And that social life is a source of pleasure, but it's not just a source of pleasure, it also gives our lives purpose and it gives them meaning. And it's also a basis, fundamentally, for our sense of self. So yes, going back to the point that I started, yes, everyone in this room is unique, but actually, I never say paradoxically, because I think there are very few true paradoxes. This is not a paradox. But actually, that's a reflection of the uniqueness of the social spaces that we occupy. We all belong to a constellation of different groups that give us each a different pattern or a different fabric to ourself. But actually, our individuality is the most profound expression of our sociality. And again, the final then, I said I never used the word paradoxically there. Okay. Paradoxically then, our individuality arises precisely because so many groups are important for who and what we are. And the final point I'd make is that to understand the self then, we should not turn inwards and, if you like, down the microscope and so on and look deeper and deeper into our genetics or independent of the society from which we come. That's exactly what Clyde, I think, is saying. That actually, to understand the self, we need to turn towards society, not away from it. Now, that might seem like a rather, not a significant point. I hope I've convinced you that it's a profound point that has a range of implications. I think that is a message that's relevant to this talk, but it's a message I think that's relevant to science and to society. Individual scientists need communities, and I think those communities need individual scientists. And it's the, if you like, the ability of structures, political and intellectual, to fuse those things and to harness the power of the individual in creative ways that, again, I think is fundamental to human progress and human sociality. I'd like to end just by thanking CIFAR for doing precisely that, creating a community in which I think each of us as individual scientists can feel better, and that we can feel we can make a real difference because our energies are fused with those of our colleagues, and that they've created a wonderful audience, yourselves, who, if you like, provide us with the ultimate test for our ideas and the ultimate motivation. Thank you very much.
So what we're going to do now is have a little conversation with ourselves, and you're going to listen, I hope, and think about what questions you'd like to ask, and then at the point at which it'll be your turn to ask questions, if you raise your hand, someone will magically appear with a microphone, and you'll get to ask a question, okay? So all of you have heard from each other, and this is a very CIFAR-like moment because your understandings support and buttress each other. And one of the reasons we wanted to have this event in this way is to demonstrate that people who come at a question from different angles actually enrich your understanding of the question and give you a sense that much more is at play than you would have thought when you first began. And what I'd like to ask, if you don't think it's too personal, is has your research on this topic in any way affected your own sense of identity? Anybody want to try that one out?
Okay. Well, one of the things I have to say is that some of this stuff of understanding the developmental capacities in relation to the much more evolved and, if you'd like, more cerebral elements of identity that Alex and Irene were talking about has given rise to me a kind of dualism, that I spend a lot of time thinking about the person that I want to be as opposed to the person that I end up being by default. In other words, when I can feel some fairly mid-brainy things, some fairly stress response pathway things kind of driving everything and me reacting to it, as opposed to coming off of a place where I can, in a way, kind of get beyond that and, see myself in a broader world. So it's created a form of dualism for me, a kind of a tension there. But it's an interesting kind of consciousness. There's days in which I wish I could get away from it, but there it is.
Irene, would you like to take this question up a little bit or not?
Sure, somewhat. I think I'm going to reverse it, though. It's more, why am I, if you ask some of my colleagues at the University of California, Berkeley, there's one or two who's like, all Irene thinks about is immigration. It's immigration, immigration, immigration. It's like, isn't there anything else that exists in the world? And clearly, it's, I think, almost the other way around, that my identity or my experiences, I believe very strongly both what Clyde and Alex are saying, brought me on this pathway. So I was, my father was a geologist. I was born in Spain. We lived in Greece. We lived in England. They were Dutch. My first language was Dutch. We come to Canada. I'm really young. I was 3 or 4. I hit Montessori because my mom's like, she has to learn English. I learned English. And that's a very cosmopolitan background, at least up till my 4. And then I spend my formative years in Canada, go through the public school system, go to McGill, get my bachelor's degree in political science, get a master's degree in sociology, go to Harvard for my PhD. And I have now been in the United States 15 years, which is becoming a more and more significant proportion of my total life. And if you ask me what my identity is, it would still be Canadian first and foremost, and I don't get it on certain levels. Like, I truly don't get it, because if you add up the time I've actually been in Canada, it's getting to be about half of my lifetime. And so why was that so imprinted on my brain? And maybe it was because it was at some formative stage in my life. It was definitely because my formative years in K to 12 education were in Canada, and so these contexts, etc. But I also really fundamentally believe that it has to do with public policy. And so I think that my personal identity pathway has brought me to this question. But it also places me in a really difficult situation when I'm in the United States, because I'm not a US citizen. And so here I am, this scholar of immigration who thinks everyone should be participating in becoming a citizen. And I've had a few cases where people have wanted to bring me to Congress and talk about my research, and then I sort of whisper to them, like, not an American. And they're like, oh, can't get you to Congress, too bad. And it's not that my research doesn't stand on its own. My research stands on its own. But in the particularly politically inflected topic of immigration, things can be used against you in a lot of different ways. So I've heard that my research has actually influenced American policy on some of this stuff, but it's been done by other people who reference my research.
That's interesting.
That is interesting.
Yes. Now, I know, Alex, you're much too young to have spent any time in any residential home, but I'm wondering whether you also have had your research affect your sense of identity.
Well, I think, I think the fundamental point is I think that being in CIFAR has created new identities for me. So prior to being part of the group I'm in, I think I and my colleagues have defined ourselves fairly narrowly as psychologists. But increasingly I become interested in issues of health, as I've illuminated. I didn't have that interest at all. I'd never done any research in care homes. I'd never done any research that indexed health constructs. And similarly, I work with a lot of economists. I didn't know anything about economics. So I think as a scientist, I think my orientation to my own field has changed, and those of the people working in cognate areas has changed. But also, I see that as entirely positive, though. I think I've got a much kind of bigger imagination as a result of that being fueled by the imaginations of other people. And I'm sure that's true for everybody here.
So my experience when I watch CIFAR groups work together, and I have to say this is one of the most wonderful things I get to do, is I get to walk into a room where a lot of very, very intelligent people are struggling with a complicated question and working together. And sometimes I would swear that you can see a mind melt going on of something bigger than anybody's individual mind appearing in the room. Clyde knows this is so. It appears in the room, sort of hovers over the table, not literally, but metaphorically. And you can see something new being created, not just a new idea, but a new way of thinking that is communicating itself to the whole group. And if you're someone like me watching from the outside, because I'm not a member of the group, you can also see people's heads start to nod as they are all kind of together coming to a new understanding. So in a way, some of the things that Alex has been saying about the importance of social connectedness happens in these rooms of people working together. And I have to say, these are not necessarily comfortable places, because they're not simply reaffirming for each other what they already think. In fact, they're struggling to understand something new that they don't understand yet. But it still has this very positive sense of creating a social group that's different from the individuals in the room, connected to them, but also putting people in a new space. Now, I hope this isn't just my sentimental notion of what it is that happens in CIFAR groups that I watch.
Well,
but is that a fair description?
I think it is. I mean, if I can interject, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And this is something I study as an organizational psychologist, is the process of creativity. And a lot of people think that creativity is something that vested in individuals as individuals. It isn't. It actually takes particular group dynamics to unlock creativity. You've got to create motivation to be creative. You've got to create the audience that's receptive to that creativity. And the contours of that are defined by shared identity. So there's, in organizational domains, a phenomenon called the not invented here phenomenon. We don't listen to other people when they are other, when they're not part of self. So again, I think part of the success of CIFAR and the kinds of groups that it creates are that it creates identity-based or identity-defined dialogue of a completely novel form, because it's creating these new, powerful identities. And I think that's true in whatever domain you work. And actually it just underlines the point that I think we're all making, that actually identity is central to social and intellectual life in profound ways that we haven't really fully understood. And I think, so we do both live the science, but also try to understand it more. And I think we're only really just beginning.
Yes. There's no question that the forms that the CIFAR programs take, particularly the ones I've been part of, I know this, are the basis on which creativity can emerge. And so, for instance, in order to do the kind of work we've been doing, we've had to find ways to merge between natural and social sciences at a fairly high level. So if you think about that concept of biological embedding, it's what we would call a consilience concept. In other words, it is something that is meant to be a bridge between the natural and the social sciences. And you only get that when you have the right people in the room together for a long enough time to understand what each other's talking about and to start to build those bridges. And so now, where we're at with this phenomenon of epigenetics, we're at the point of saying, you know what? Genetics is more a social science than it is a natural science at this point. Why? Because in order to understand what is going to land and stick, you have to understand so much more about social process. Some of you may have noticed that when I put up the slide, there was lots of associations, in terms of epigenetic marks between the things I talked about and so forth, but that the mark of mother smoking during pregnancy was weaker than abuse, which was weaker than socioeconomic status. Now, if you asked the average bench scientist which way it would go the other way in terms of what they would expect, because they would have a certain explanatory paradigm, right? But now we're in this situation where we can put together people like the two on my left and right who have way better understanding about how people actually function in groups. And then we can turn around and say, okay, well, how do we model these in these models, right? So the idea of going out and looking for the epigenetic signature of alternate identities is the sort of thing that would be advocated for here. And I'm prepared to bet a month's salary that that will be a larger signature than what a bunch of bench scientists would imagine, because they will end up imagining, well, what does HIV do? What does, this toxin do, or something like that? They will be thinking in a very, very different form, right? And what the CIFAR programs have done is allowed to build those bridges of consilience so that we can not only daydream about these kind of things and think we're nuts, but we can actually express them and get on and do the work.
So I'm going to ask just one more question of each of you, and it's about what is the next research area or the next question you're thinking about that you would most like to have an answer for? The thing you would most be excited to be able to answer. Irene, do you think you have a sense of what that might be?
Well, as a good academic, I'm not going to give you one answer.
Okay.
We never give one answer
Top three.
to anything. Yeah, here are my 4, 5, 6 wish lists. 2 things that I'm very interested in is, given what I talked about in terms of the backlash against multiculturalism, is that there's clearly a lot of anxiety in all kinds of societies about rapid demographic change. And it's because that rapid demographic change brings other people in contact with us. And I do it in the context of international migration, but you can imagine all kinds of other moments in time when rural people moved to cities, or there were other kinds of major changes. You can imagine, Hurricane Katrina devastating New Orleans, and so the changes in the societies we live in, the context, the neighborhoods we live in. And often, we're not allowed to talk about how we don't like people for cultural or racial or religious reasons. That's not politically correct in our societies. People do it, but you're not really supposed to. But a lot of the anxiety is cultural, or it's something related to these people are other, these people are different. And so one of the conversations that I'd like to have even more in the future with Alex, who is in the CIFAR program that I'm at, is what are some of the techniques, what are some of the things that we can do that people who normally would see each other as completely other we'd actually be able to do something that you have a connection, and then you start feeling, maybe not necessarily that you're Canadian, but that you feel a member of your neighborhood, or you feel a member of this little area in space, or it doesn't even have to be physical space, maybe it'd be virtual world. So one of the things I'm really interested in is how do we make those connections that bridge this sense of otherness so that we can actually feel cohesive. And I have lots of other projects, but I'll leave it at that.
That's a big enough one.
That's a big one. That's a big one.
Alex, you want to answer that question?
I think, again, part of the beauty of this program, actually, and I'll say this, I could answer, give you a project, but I won't, because actually the real beauty of CIFAR is all my rest of my academic life, and Kath's here and she'll say the same thing, we have to write grants, and we have to say what we're going to do, and we have to plot it out in minute detail, years and years ahead, and we have to justify it, we stick that path, and if we deviate from it, it's a nightmare. The beauty about coming to CIFAR is actually I don't have to do that. I can just come and think and talk and go where the flow takes me. I think that's actually how good science gets done. So I have a few questions, but I know, and I could if I have a month's salary, I know that anything I say will never be what I do, because at the end of the day, it will be this beautiful collaborative process that will take me somewhere will be far more interesting.
That was good.
Why would you like to answer that question?
Okay.
You can say no. You can
No.
say I don't want to answer that question.
No, it's all right. It's not an easy question. I feel a lot like Alex feels about that. But I would say, thinking forward about the things that I'm involved in, there's a number of things that I'm really excited to stick around for. Although my presentation this time was very much about things under the skin. People may be aware that I operate cell to society. So if you want to say, what I'd really be excited for, I'm going to give 2 things, right? On the one hand, in terms of the direction that this work is going, I really do want to stick around long enough to understand if what we think we're seeing is true, which is to say that the way in which social experience influences the genome is not so much that it goes for this specific gene loci or that one, but that instead it seems to shower the genome with chemical changes, in effect, that may be very large, so that there would be a signature of life is going to be hard, right? So a number of things, that might have to do with the quality of your early domestic environment might give a broad evolutionary signal that life is going to be hard, and that will have all sorts of different effects on a whole range of different gene loci way upstream that will then end up playing out downstream. And we now have the technologies to be able to see that, whether or not this works as like a shower, a non-specific sort of evolutionary showering signal, as opposed to sort of a very sort of surgically picking out this gene versus that gene signal. So that's what I want to know at that end. But the other end, people should know that one of the things that I'm involved with is monitoring the rights of the child around the world. And we've developed a protocol for monitoring, in particular, the rights in early childhood that 193 countries of the world have signed up for. And I want to stick around long enough to figure out whether or not really trying to find ways to get countries to live up to their commitment will actually have an effect on the state of children's development in those countries. And we've put out a protocol. I give it a 1 in 50 chance of getting funded at this point, but within 5 years I think we'll get the money and away we'll go, and that'll hopefully keep me going.
Yeah. Wonderful, thank you. So now's your turn. And if anybody would like to ask a question, there's somebody who needs a microphone, and here's somebody who needs a microphone. So first that one, and then here.
Hello.
Hi, John.
My
gosh, someone I recognize.
Yeah, I used to work for these guys.
Yes.
Perhaps it's because it's election day, and perhaps because I'm a recovering politician. But this question comes to mind. Is it possible that amongst the three of you, you can produce a kind of unified field theory, which starts, I think, with Clyde's observation about how social life affects outcomes for very young children? I like the way he led to rights, you see, but rights is associated at the upper end with, it seems to me, with citizenship, and it's mediated in the middle by what Alex does through groups. So it seems to me that the highest form is citizenship because it's purposeful. It assumes that social institutions can be changed, it assumes some kind of normative behavior, and that we can actually improve ourselves. We don't have to be resigned to some kind of fate. So I'm wondering if the three of you could get together and by the end of the evening produce a unified field theory for me.
Who's going to take that one on?
Well, I'm just going to say, I think you've actually outlined the Godfrey unified field theory right there. I mean, I think that is how this fits together. And I think it's really important to think that way. I mean, as Alec was talking about what he was talking about and showed the socially isolated person, I'm sitting there thinking about the neurobiological phenomenon that would predispose towards more or less social isolation. Just to give one example, I mean, there's been this study. It's a beautifully done study. It's a very sad study, though, done in Wisconsin by a fellow by the name of Seth Pollock, where they got children who'd been removed from their homes because of abuse, basically, and kids who hadn't been. And at age 5, they put the little shower cap with leads on it and showed them a series of pictures of the same adult face, starting very smiling and welcoming, and then a little less smiley and a little less smiley, and a little more angry and a little more angry, etc. So 10 faces across, a series of these things, and waited to see when the kids showed a fear response. To make a long story short, what happens is the kids who have grown up in those environments where there's been abuse, they have a threshold shift. So they start seeing anger and something to be afraid of in those faces after you're about 3 or 4 faces along, whereas the other kids don't see any anger until you're about 7 or 8 faces along. So you can imagine what that means for the prospects of belonging, right? For that first child, the majority of the faces looking at me right now would be profoundly threatening, right? How does a person like that belong in the sense that Alec is talking about, right? I mean, it's a profound question and a very difficult question. And at the same time, it's very interesting when, somebody like Irene goes out and asks her questions, you get responses. I mean, the people I'm talking about respond to her questions, and I'd like to know how they respond. I mean, do people who grow up in those kind of world end up being predisposed to notions of citizenship that are about self-denial and affiliation, let's say, with things military or something like that? I mean, can you start to see those kind of differences emerging over time versus those who feel themselves more part of the softer elements of the community? It would be wonderful to know those kind of things, right? And out of those things, we could validate the Godfrey unified field theory.
Anybody else want to add to or subtract from the Godfrey unified field theory?
One of the things that I find exciting, because I think you're right, that there's obvious links across us, is that sociologists are often blamed, I guess, for not having any agency in our theories, right? Because the very purpose of a sociologist is to tell you why the reason you are the way you are has nothing to do with you, but it has everything to do with the social structures in which you're embedded. And so if you are a successful person who has had a rich life, made a lot of money, et cetera, has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with your upbringing and your social structure and your position, et cetera. And the problem, of course, is that you don't have that much dynamism and change in those stories. And in different ways, I think that often people who study genes are probably criticized for the same way. Well, if you do all this stuff on genes and you see that people have an authoritarian personality, then that's socially determinative and everything else is going to follow. And one of the exciting things, but I don't think any of us have an answer to, is that the stories we're telling is that humans do have agency, in that if you went out to vote and if that actually changes public policies, not only might it change how people feel about citizenship, but it might change how the kids are growing up. And then it might change the institutions that are allowing people to feel socially isolated or not when they're in care homes. And so on a certain level, one of the things that I really appreciate about being able to speak to all of you tonight is that when I write academic articles, they're only read by a bunch of other academics. And that's nice, and I'm glad that I'm contributing to that discourse in sociological theories of immigration and incorporation. But a lot of what I want to do is I also want to engage with people who are living a normal life and talk to them about my research, but then also learn from them. So I try to talk about my research also to immigrant communities and then have people come up to me afterwards and either tell me that I'm dead wrong and I don't have it right, and so they can help me think through this. Or when people, it's obviously a little bit more exciting when people, well, not more exciting, it's just gratifying. When people come up and say, hey, that really matches what, I never thought about it that way, but that makes sense to me. And so, at least for me, one of the reasons that I love sociology and political science both, and social science more generally, is that it's about not only learning for the sake of learning, which is what you fundamentally have to do to understand what's going on, but then communicating that learning and then hoping that other people can take it on and use it for various purposes.
Want to add to that?
No, there's so many people got questions. Let's just ration our answers.
Fiona? I think someone needs to get a microphone to Fiona.
No, I don't really need one.
Good for you, Fiona. Save the electricity.
Right. I'd like to, John, I'm a recovering politician. And so I'm hearing what the three of you have been saying in terms of public policy. Because I'm particularly interested in little children and the future and in public health as opposed to all the sickness institutions that we have, and how much better we could use our public Medicare as a preventer rather than as a pretty poor cure. And I'm wondering, as a result of the research that you have already done, when you're going to take this show on the road to the politicians who are going to be elected tonight and get them to do things right for a change.
Fiona, I'm not touching that one, but these folks might. I too am a recovering politician. Anybody here want to take that on?
Yeah, so, I think Irene's right. I mean, that one of the things I think that CIFAR does is nurture our willingness to engage in those kinds of processes. It gives us some confidence. I would say that prior to being a member of CIFAR, I'd never had really that many of those conversations, but actually I think CIFAR is an absolute model of an outreach organisation that really, galvanises, as it were, talent in a particular form and puts them in the right places to speak to people. So actually, through CIFAR, when I come to Canada, on several occasions, myself and my colleagues have engaged in policy debate with public servants and with opinion makers of particular forms, with a specific view of, if you like, getting the message out there, getting the conversation going, and hopefully having informed, evidence-based public policy. So again, insofar as Canada has something like CIFAR, you have a vehicle for those kinds of activities. I think if you talk to anyone in CIFAR, they're going to say, yeah, absolutely, you provide us with the person, and we will put the people in front of them, sort of thing. So, I have to say, I think, like Irene, to the extent that those opportunities are afforded us through this great organisation, that's the way forward. And increasingly, what you see is silos. I think, particularly in countries like my own, between sort of academia and government, and I think that's a very, very dangerous state of affairs for all sorts of reasons.
Irene, I know that you've spent some time talking to the people in the immigration department and the Metropolis conference.
Right.
You want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. As recovering politicians, for those in the room who are so inclined, you know that politics is not easy. And just like that, academics can debate these things. So, I could name you a bunch of people who could come up on this stage and say that I was entirely wrong, that I have it entirely wrong, that multiculturalism is a really bad thing, especially in Europe, and that it alienates immigrants, it provides bad labor outcomes, and they would spin a story to that effect. And I can even give you citations of articles that have been published on that level. And of course, I disagree. And so one level is, just as we have political debates, academics have debates. Now, what I would hope, of course, in academia is that if we can bring solid research to bear, the weight of the evidence will go more one way than the other. And I would like to believe that the weight of the evidence is going to be going on my side. But maybe it's just because I talk to my friends. Maybe less facetiously, but I have had conversations with people in Ottawa. CIFAR facilitated an event where I did a talk on, I have some other research that is looking, let me take a step back. The group that I am a member of, the Social Interactions, Identity, and Wellbeing group, on the advisory committee, there's a very prominent political scientist named Robert Putnam, and he's done some really interesting research looking at the United States that shows that people who live in more diverse settings, and for his research, it was mostly done by ethno-racial categories that are used in the United States: African American, Latino, Asian American, white. People who live in those more diverse settings have less social trust in others and seem less likely to engage in community-based activity. And it's not just with people from those other groups, but even within their own group. So if you live in a more diverse setting, you're less likely to engage with others, even within your own group. And he has all kinds of controls to make sure that it's not just in big cities, people just don't talk to each other or things of this nature. And it's a pretty, disquieting conclusion if we know that immigration is going to continue in the future, especially given the demography and the aging population in many Western countries. And so I got very interested in how public policies might influence and mediate a potential relationship between a reaction potentially to diversity and change, and then some of these outcomes in terms of lower trust, organizational involvement, etc. A co-author and I just published a paper last summer in the Canadian Journal of Political Science, and this is a paper that I shopped actually in our program a few times, which shows that relationship between diversity on the one hand and less social trust, less organizational involvement on the other hand, if you look across 19 OECD countries, it is mediated by the level of inequality in the society. So more unequal societies where the rich are really rich and the poor are really poor. That relationship between diversity, lower social capital, social trust is much more prevalent. So you have more to lose. You have a sense that you have more to lose, and so change in terms of demographic change is probably felt as more threatening. And so more equal societies have less of this issue in terms of diversity and social trust. And countries, and this is where I think I'm right, Countries around multiculturalism, countries that have multiculturalism, either mitigate the negative relationship, or in the case of organizational involvement, actually you find that countries that have multiculturalism and rising immigration actually show more organizational involvement among the majority population. And that was some of the research that I presented in Ottawa. Now, you know, social scientists, we do these big findings, and you know, some of the people in the room in Ottawa were like, what should I do in Hamilton? I don't know what you should do in Hamilton. I mean, you know, I don't know Hamilton. I mean, I can give you these big ideas, but then at a certain level, it's up to other people to take those big ideas and then actually tailor it to the local environment. But you know, you hope your ideas matter. And I have been told that in the United States, my research was used with other people's work as well to start funding some of the immigrant settlement work that I talked about. Very small, like $8 million, I think, last year, which for the United States, of course, is like small change. But still, bigger than zero.
Thank you. Can someone get a mic to Raquel Midvar? There she is. You think your voice will carry? Denzel has a microphone for you if you'd like to use it.
That speaks to your social network at CIFAR, that you can actually call out each one of us by our names. Good on you, Khaviva. My question is very particularly to Irene, and I'm curious about a rising theme in Canada, and it goes back to your answer. If you are your citizenship, then who are you if you have more than one citizenship? And is that, in fact, a problem? Or is it a hierarchy of belonging that can be equated back to public policy responses to your needs?
So is multiple citizenship a problem?
Yeah.
Good question. The way that I come at my research, as a sociologist, I should stay away from normative political theory, I should stay away from political messaging, and I should really stick with my data, and I can do that. But in the end point, I'm coming at a perspective that I think engagement with a society, democratic engagement, is a good thing. You know, I think that's a good thing. And luckily, Alex can give me some data now to show that if you empower people in a senior home, that is a good thing. So I think being engaged with your society is a good thing. If you accept that presumption, research shows, and this includes some of my research, but other research as well, that people who might have multiple citizenships and act on those citizenships, so actually participate politically in their homeland and in the country that they're living in, that participation in the homeland actually spills over to increased participation in the domestic context. And so rather than be a zero-sum trade-off, like, hey, if you're doing things back in your homeland, you're not doing it here, or if you're paying all this attention to what's going on there, you're disengaged here, is actually wrong, that it's actually a positive sum experience when it comes to political participation. And you can think of lots of different reasons why that might be the case. And I'll give you a very specific example of someone I interviewed. This was a young woman who was born in Vietnam, grew up mostly in Toronto, and she became politically active with human rights issues in Vietnam. So she was part of PEN Canada, she was part of Amnesty, she was really oriented to homeland politics in Vietnam. And a lot of Vietnamese in North America, Canada and the United States are very concerned with what goes on because they're a refugee population and obviously interested in that. So you'd look at that and you go, well, she's not engaged in Canadian society, isn't that sort of an issue? Why are all her attentions there? And then she went up to Ottawa and started lobbying on behalf of human rights. And as she did that, she made connections with other advocacy organizations on the Hill. And her advocacy slowly started to expand to not only include human rights issues in Vietnam, but also issues for her community and generally human rights issues in Canada. And so she was able to leverage the skills that she had in dealing with human rights in Vietnam, learning how to write a letter, learning how to talk to politicians, learning how to get people together in a room to try to work towards some end. And she used it for domestic political ends, let's say. So if what you're interested in, and what I am interested in, is democratic engagement, I do not think that multiple citizenships are a problem. But if you have some other interest in mind, then it might become another, well, I don't know if it would become another answer, but the thinking through it might be different.
Good. I think we have come to the end of what we can ask here, but there are things to drink and things to eat. So as soon as we've finished, you can go out there, we can all eat and drink and talk to everybody. And you can ask anybody any question you'd like to ask. So I think I'm going to welcome Frank back onto the stage.
Thank you one and all for joining us this evening. sorry to say that we draw this part to a close, but as Aviva said, there's food and drink and a number of researchers in the room and others that perhaps the conversation can continue. As we say at CIFAR, we hope this is not the end of a conversation, but the beginning of one. I want to thank the three participants for making such an interesting evening, and as I promised at the beginning, it would be thought-provoking, and I'm sure it has been for all of us. Thank you, each and every one of you, for making this a great event, and thank you for your support of CIFAR, and thank you for being part of this wonderful organization. So with that, I invite you next door to some food and drink and further conversation. Thanks once again. Thanks, Aviva, for making this work. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Frank.